Okay, I think we'll get started. I think probably a few other people will be joining in as we go along, but we'll just get some of the introductory and initial stuff started before we get into it. My name is Wil Brant. I'll try to be here on the screen. I am the director at Gerber Hart Library and Archives, and we're here tonight with Lauren Herold, who is a PhD candidate at Northwestern. Her area of focus is on LGBTQ public access shows. So that is what we will be talking about. We needing to shift the focus of the program this evening a little bit. That originally we were going to have Lauren interview folks from the 10% show, John Ryan, Sarah Siegel, and Tim Rowan. We're going to focus on that. Unfortunately, John had a heart attack a couple days ago. He is doing okay. He's recovering. And we're rescheduling the panel that focuses on the folks from the 10% show, John, Sarah, and Tom. We're going to reschedule that for 2 weeks from now, Wednesday, May 13th. I'll be posting a link to register for that. So what we're shifting to tonight, instead of interviewing the folks from the 10% show, since John is not going to be able to be with us, is to have a discussion with Lauren about the research that she's doing about public access TV, the different shows that they have. So then in 2 weeks, we'll switch over and do a more in-depth discussion specifically on the 10% show here in Chicago. Maybe touch also tonight a little bit on Gerber Hart's holdings of these TV shows. Lauren, I guess maybe start off with, because I've been a little fuzzy about what exactly a public access show is. I mean, if you kind of maybe just let us know what exactly is a public access show and how might that, what is that in relation to other types of TV shows or things we may see?
That's a great question, and I just want to say thanks for organizing this tonight. I'm looking forward to, working with you in the next couple of weeks to reschedule the interview with the 10% show folks. But it's great just to chat with you. And I've since I started volunteering with Gerber Hart, it's been great to get to know the folks there. So thinking back to the first few decades of television history, most of the programming aired on broadcast networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, and eventually PBS became sort of a fourth network. And in the 1970s, cable was invented as a new technology, or developed as a new technology, to expand programming access and the number of channels available on television. And along with cable television came something called cable access. The FCC mandated in 1972 that cable companies had to take one or two channels from the new cable channels and devote them to public educational and governmental programming, and they called those channels public access cable television channels. And so where LGBTQ people come in is that a lot of these cable companies had to allow folks in their local community access to their equipment or to the station, to the airtime on a first come, first served basis. So what this meant was that folks who had been historically underrepresented on television had the opportunity to create their own TV for the first time, basically for very low cost. So that you had, feminist groups and LGBTQ groups and all different kinds of community groups creating their own TV shows that aired in their local communities. And some of the very first programs LGBTQ programs aired in New York. So I'm specifically studying the LGBTQ cable access shows that aired in New York because it was the first city wired for cable, and it had the most LGBTQ cable access shows. However, it was really a national phenomenon, and there were gay cable access shows all around the country and in Chicago as well. Does that help clarify?
Yeah, and that's but I was wondering, there was also, you could do a show series, but could you also do like a one-shot sort of special focus type show, or was it supposed to be a series?
That's a good question, actually. I assume that you could just do a one-off show, and I'm sure that happened. Like, people tried it out and then never came back, but I don't really know how often that occurred.
Okay. Yeah, for some reason, I think I remember seeing some shows that, some, like a LGBTQ group would do like an issue show that they'll focus on a certain issue and want to present that as a way to, again, to get a way to get their message out. And you
Totally.
did mention that you did focus on New York, and well, in New York, there was this, as you know, the the gay cable network, which kind of produced a lot of shows. A lot of their segments went out to other places around the U.S. They're kind of a hub for it all, and the 10% show, some of the original episodes of it actually used segments from that show. So again, even though you're focusing on that, the impact of it was around the U.S. So again, that's sort of the initiator of a lot, or maybe the instigator of a lot of it.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, the Gay Cable Network is a really interesting example. It was founded by this man named Lou Maletta, who was sort of an entrepreneur and as well as a pornographer. So his programming sort of combined like sexually explicit content with political content, with news content, with entertainment programming. And he created a lot of different shows in New York and really wanted to create this sort of national network of LGBTQ programs and stations, that something that wouldn't really happen until, like a Logo became the first sort of gay cable channel in the early 2000s, but he had this vision in the 80s, and it was sort of taken up by a lot of gay producers around the country, like in Chicago.
Well, how did you come across wanting to focus your research on LGBTQ public access shows?
That's a good question. I had no idea these shows even existed. I think most people don't. But I was watching a few years ago. I was watching the documentary based on Vito Russo's life called Vito, directed by Jeffrey Schwartz. I think it's on HBO. And in the documentary, there's a few-minute segment on this show that Vito Russo co-hosted and co-produced called Our Time in 1983. And I had never heard of this show. And I was sort of shocked I had never heard of this because I used to work at GLAAD, the LGBTQ media advocacy organization that Vito Russo helped co-found. So I thought I knew all about his sort of life and legacy. So when I heard about the show, I decided I was curious if there were any others. And I started researching and finding out that there were a lot of LGBTQ cable access shows, but that the history hasn't really been well preserved, and they're not really remembered as an important part of queer television history. So I decided that might be a gap that I could fill, both in order to preserve this history, to honor the work of all these people, and to show like how important cable access was to the industry and to the movement.
Well, what would be some of those important aspects for the LGBTQ movement that the cable access shows did?
Yeah, great question. Well, certainly during the 1980s, in the early years of the AIDS epidemic, cable access became a really important place for sexual health education because there were really very few censorship regulations of cable access. People could show, you could show like a condom demonstration on TV way before condom commercials were even airing on the broadcast networks. You could show genitals. You could have really frank discussions about sex that otherwise would have been censored on ABC, NBC, CBS, and of course during the 80s those the news programs were really hesitant to talk about AIDS, especially in the early years, because there's so much stigma and homophobia surrounding it. So cable access became a way for the community to educate each other about the epidemic. Not the only way, but certainly one forum for discussion.
Yeah, that's one thing, because I take college groups to tour of Gerber Hart a lot, and we have these PSAs, public service posters about condom use, and they think nothing of them, but back in the 80s and even into the 90s, just the word condom, you couldn't say or use it.
Totally.
So yeah, I think we forget a lot about that. And I know that, from my own perspective, because I moved to Chicago in '89, which is when the 10% show just started showing.
Right.
So it gave me sort of an interesting perspective or awareness of the spectrum of what was going on the LGBT community at that time, both from politics, but also from entertainment, culture, awareness of organizations. And looking back at some of the more recent posts that we did of the 10% show, recording certain parts of critical history that would have never been recorded or preserved. So like the most recent one that I posted was when Mayor Daley walked out of the community meeting about the city's response to AIDS, which again, you could read about it in the newspapers at that time, but they did the full coverage of everything that was going on, as well as interviews of community leaders at that time afterwards. So again, it gives an interesting historical perspective that we don't there, but also that that real time perspective that I don't think a lot of people realize that was there.
That's so true. And I think that's an amazing episode. I just watched it earlier today when you see Mayor Daley walk out and all these LGBT community leaders like yelling shame, and it's a really powerful footage. And I think that's another fascinating aspect of these shows, is that they captured so much AIDS activist footage that often, wasn't covered. Maybe it wasn't covered by the broadcast networks, but you see this sort of record of queer activism in the 80s and 90s that hasn't really been preserved elsewhere. And the footage is so powerful because you can really feel the emotions and the intensity of the folks present who are so angry and so passionate and fighting for their lives.
Well, because the cable access started in the 70s. So what were they covering in terms of politics back in the 70s?
Yeah. That's a good question. There's much fewer shows in the 70s and in the 80s, and also they have not been well preserved.
Okay.
The Gay Activist Alliance had a show in the very early 70s, like 71 to 73. They were mostly filming their demonstrations. From what I've learned about it, the tapes are no longer available. There was another show in the later 70s, Emerald City. They covered like Anita Bryant, her anti-gay campaign, and they covered other sort of like gay civil rights, legislation happening at the time, sort of local in different states, anti-sodomy ordinances and civil rights ordinances. So definitely the rise of the moral majority at the end of the 70s is an important story to cover.
And were those tapes preserved, or Emerald City?
Yes. So luckily, there is one remaining producer, and his name is Steve B. He's taken it upon himself to really like preserve the legacy of the show. So those tapes are archived at New York's LGBT Community Center, but he put some of them on YouTube too. Okay. Just helpful for me.
Yeah. No. That's well. Again, I think that the whole YouTube phenomena has helped us to preserve and present these to a new generation. Both for, again, in some ways, I mean, some of the stuff is the same and some of it has changed, but just both for the historical aspect, but also in terms of what exactly is culture and history. And what I found interesting looking at the 10% show stuff is sort of the spectrum. So it is not just all political. I mean, you do have these entertainment sections, some information about community organizations, various conferences and stuff that was happening all around. And also, again, I don't know if this was specific to 10% show, but also the diversity. So there's focus on, African American and queer experience, as well as, women's movement within the LGBTQ movement. So there's this wide spectrum of a community presented. And that's why I think some ways in, sort of my awareness of it, if the 10% show was sort of like my initial awareness of it, I was exposed to sort of the diversity of the community as opposed to some people that maybe didn't have that exposure as that much.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear you talk more about your own experiences watching the show as someone who viewed them when they aired. But yeah, just to comment on what you just said, I mean, actually, I do think the 10% show did maybe a better job than most at sort of representing the wide spectrum of the community, particularly having like a woman and an African-American man as co-hosts. Most of the shows I've watched are sort of like hosted and produced by white gay men. And there's, on-screen diversity every once in a while, but not necessarily the norm. So I'm actually interested in talking to the 10% show folks about this in a couple weeks to ask like how intentional was that? But certainly like these shows represent the diversity of the community much better than anything else that was on TV at the time, which, as we know, are often very limited and stereotypical representations of mostly gay and lesbian people.
Well, I'm wondering if, because at the time I'm thinking more about print publication. that in the 70s and the 80s, a lot of lesbian work was much more within the feminist movement.
Right.
So I wonder if more the cable access shows that more represented lesbian concern, lesbian interest, or more under the frame of feminist programming as opposed to specifically gay and lesbian programming.
That's a great research question. I don't know the answer to that.
Your second project,
Yeah.
I'll assign it to you. But yeah, so yeah, that might be it, because I was also thinking, you know, in terms of, again, comparing it to the lesbian and feminist publication movement, that there was this aspect creation, producing, distribution, and what I see in this movement, sort of like the gay cable network, is sort of like that similar aspect in terms of video. That there was this, you know, needing to be able to produce an accurate representation, you need to have that control, and at that time, the only way you can get that was through cable access shows, to be able to have that aspect of it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about it in that way exactly. It's a good comparison to sort of the print publications. I will say there is one sort of lesbian feminist show that starts airing in 1993 called Dyke TV.
Yes, Dyke TV.
Oh, were you going to bring that up?
Well, no, I knew about it. And that was part of the gay cable network, right?
It was like they did a sort of similar thing where they worked with local producers, and in Chicago too, I think, to air their program all around the country.
Okay, I didn't know that. Well, I think that even appeared on some PBS channels, didn't it? Besides just cable access, or I have heard that. I may be wrong.
That could be. I'm not sure about that. I know there was a PBS show called In the Life that aired starting in 1992, I think. And I think, you know, a lot of these people worked together, so some of the same producers worked on all these shows, and it's possible that some of the content was the same.
Yeah. Well, what is the difference between PBS and cable access?
Yeah, the names are really similar: public television and public access cable television. The major difference is the distribution system, I guess. Cable access is local, airs in a local community, generally made by people in that local community. And public television is a national system that works with a system of affiliates in different cities. Public broadcasting also gets its funding structure is different too. Gets its funding from like the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So public television often has a much higher production value. You'll see like the public television programs have budgets of hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe millions, thousands of dollars, and cable access will have a budget in the thousands of dollars. So cable access looks much more sort of homemade usually than public television.
I guess more self-funded.
Right.
But then so that's why when the 10%, the New York gay cable network couldn't show something on Chicago like the cable access networks in Chicago, but 10% show could use segments for their own production of it, which is what they did.
Yeah, and they would have to be like mailed, the people in New York would have to mail a videotape to people here. And
well, even because actually I have some of the tapes from the 10% show, and so like this one was mailed there, this one was mailed there. So even within Chicago, they mailed them to the different networks or something.
That's so cool that you have that record.
Yeah, we have the record. I have one here. So that's one aspect. Again, we don't think about that today in terms of they actually had to mail these things out and about.
Right. The technology has changed so much.
So what about the content? Because 10% shows a news magazine. What types of cable LGBTQ cable access shows were there out and about there?
Yeah, so News Magazine was a really popular format, and for folks who don't know what that is, it's generally a show that has a number of segments, usually the same segments week after week, but each segment has sort of a different focus. So you have like an art segment, you'll have a news segment, maybe you have like an interview segment, and all of those are usually sort of hosted by one or two people. It's sort of, it's like as if it was a print magazine, but in a television format. So a lot of the news magazine was popular because you could sort of have a lot of different types of content, and with the idea that it would have a broad appeal. But as sort of as time went on, people got more and more creative with the genre. So there ended up being like game shows, like often satiric game shows. Like there was a gay dating game show. There was a gay takeoff on What's My Line, called Be My Guest. There's a lot of drag comes onto these shows. So they're become a really big forum for sort of like queer performance and drag and camp, which you can see on the 10% show. There's also talk shows or just sort of interview-based shows, and eventually even soap operas. This becomes like an early way for folks to experiment with gay scripted television, which, as we know, you don't really see successful and popular gay sitcoms until the mid-90s with Ellen and Will and Grace. So the cable access was a way for gay people to create their own, sitcoms and soap operas before it was possible on the commercial networks.
Are you familiar with Secret Passions?
I saw some of it on the 10% show.
Okay, no, I was wondering how many episodes of that. I can't figure out how many episodes of that was actually shown. Secret Passions was billed as the first LGBTQ soap opera. So everybody was LGBTQ or was focused that way. 10% show showed two episodes of it, and I can't figure out how many more episodes there were. Did I post one of the episodes? I think I did.
You did.
Yeah, I did. I did post one of the episodes. So yeah, and it wasn't really all that strongly positively reviewed by folks. So I don't know what that is. Although I will say that also at the same time, Columbia College students, they put out their own sort of soap opera. I do know at that time there was that year's version. They did it over a number of years. The 1 year's version that I remember seeing did have at least one strong, actually it was gay male storyline. So there was some representation there. But again, I think as you said, it's kind of hard to find LGBTQ representation in the 70s, 80s. It really didn't start to happen until the 90s. And this was a way that if you could find it, it was there. But again, I think the way that I stumbled on upon it, because I saw the listing, again, back in the day when they would list in the TV guide or whatever, the 10% show. So you kind of figured, oh, I know what that's about. So you check it out there. But I think also probably the LGBTQ press probably also listed it or had it noted. So I'm not quite sure how I figured it out or saw it, but that's one of those ways in which you would be able to find out about stuff. Again, there is how do you get the word out that stuff exists?
That was that was a really big challenge, I think. Also, how do people know how many people are watching was a really big challenge because there's no Nielsen ratings for cable access shows. So a lot of times people put notices in the gay press or local gay newspapers, but maybe they wouldn't be able to afford, or maybe the mainstream press wouldn't be interested in covering that kind of content. So I think getting the word out and assessing how big the audience was is definitely a challenge for all the folks that I have talked to about it.
What sort of lifespan would these shows have? Would they go on for a year or two, or was there somewhat average that you can figure out?
For the most part, I would say, maybe 1 to 3 seasons. And the exception is really, Dyke TV was a really big exception. It was on from 1993 to 2006. And all the gay cable network shows, or a lot of them were on much longer. Actually, the news show, Pride in Progress, that started on the gay cable network in 1984, it became Gay USA in 1990. It changed the name, and Gay USA is actually still on. The two people who host it, journalists and activists, and Northrup and Andy Hum, they're still hosting it every week. It's actually pretty incredible. They're wonderful. You can watch Gay USA now on YouTube, as well as on Manhattan Cable. But that's really the exception. Most of them didn't last very long because it was like volunteer labor. People were generally not being paid for their work, and it was an incredible amount of work to create these shows every week, often for people who are not professionals in the media industry, and so just took up so much time that and for folks who weren't getting paid for their work, it really wasn't sustainable.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, that they had a short longevity just because they were all volunteer. It was a group of people that decided to do it. Other things happen. I noticed in the 10% show, they started out as they only did it once a month. They started out as an hourly show, then they cut down to a half hour.
Right.
And they stopped. So I'm figuring it's probably, people get involved, they have other things involved. That's unfortunate. And in Chicago, I think that is really the only one sort of that was around. There was another one in our collection. We actually have, in Gerber Hart's collection, there's 3 public access shows that we have. We have the 10% show, which was the most significant. It ran for roughly 21 episodes, almost 2 years. There's this thing that's called the Lambda Digest, which was put out by Integrity, which is the Episcopal gay and lesbian affirming group. I don't know, it's only 1 box, so there weren't that many episodes to it. Unlike the 10% show, John Ryan's very organized. With his donation, he gave us a complete episode guide, so we know what's in them. For the other ones, we don't exactly know what's in them. I haven't had the chance to look at them yet. So there's some episodes there. And there's a 3rd one that's out of Milwaukee, which is called In and Out, In/Out. That was a Milwaukee-based cable access show. So we have those 3. And those, what we have. Again, the In and Out was, at least the episodes that they gave us were it's only, again, 1 box, so there's not that many episodes to it.
I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about digitizing these shows, what that process is like, considering the technology is so old, and how you manage that.
Yes, the technology is old. As I said, the tapes are this size. They're 3/4 inch broadcast tapes. So that's what they look like. They have these things that would be portable players that weigh about 25 pounds. So it's not too portable. We have 2 of those. I had to go clean them because they're really old and dirty. Basically, we digitized from those. The aspect is that some of these tapes haven't been used in 10, 20, 30 years. So there is that sort of care for tapes that haven't been used a while. So we have to fast forward them, rewind them to make sure that they're all working and get them in working order to digitize them. We did have the initial digitization of them happened. We had somebody that worked in the video department at a school in Chicago. So he would kind of, at the beginning of the day, he put one in there and then go and do his work and replace them. The unfortunate thing about that was that they were mixed on 2 audio channels. This may be getting a little too geeky for some people. So basically, the music was on one, and then the words were on another. So when he digitized them, you got the left and right channel differently. So I have to go back and then remix them all, either that or redigitize them. So I had an initial problem with that. We didn't realize until we started playing them back. But actually, they're digitizing pretty well. The condition of them, again, Gerber Hart has been good in its stewardship of properly preserving things and keeping them in climate control and all that sort of stuff, which temperature is the enemy of digitized digital tapes. So we're good at keeping things preserved. So they are transferring in really good shape. And actually these 3/4 inch are, I guess the quality is better than in VHS tapes, because I think episode 6 we only have of the 10% show, we only have in VHS, and the quality of that is not as good as these other ones that we're putting up. So yeah, the digitizing of it has been in pretty good pretty good shape. And we have a few, unfortunately, and what is of value in the 10% shows collection is the raw footage, because you get a lot more. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of the raw footage. I have one box of some of the raw footage of some of the later stuff, which is good. That I think I have three tapes full, and they're like 90-minute tapes of the 91 Pride Parade and that sort of stuff. So we have some significant raw footage of some of the later stuff. But unfortunately, the earlier raw footage tapes, again, it gets taped over for every show, so we kind of lost some of that earlier raw footage. Again, I have from like the in and out, we have other raw footage. I think we have a pretty full recording. I don't know if people are familiar with John Boswell. He was a scholar, religion scholar, wrote a very significant book that I can't remember the name of, about early gay, well, mostly gay, but gay and lesbian presence in early Christianity. I can't remember. Somebody else is going to tell me the name. I'm going to say, yes, that is it. But yeah, there's a pretty full interview of him, of the raw tapes from the, no, actually from Lambda Digest, from him. So yeah, so some of these things that are probably of more value, again, the finalized production is these sort of the valuable snippets that they want to produce. But I think the more extended research that, again, good for researchers is more the raw footage, which again, I don't think many shows have reserved that. Again, because those are things that they wouldn't want to preserve. So,
those are useful for like documentaries too, and you know, I don't know if documentaries have ever approached Gerber Hart to ask for that footage, but I know that a lot of footage from some of the other shows that I study have been used in documentaries about LGBTQ history, and that feels particularly important for these Midwestern shows when we know LGBTQ history has been really dominated by the sort of history of, you know, the coastal cities, particularly New York and San Francisco. So having this other historical information about queer communities in the Midwest and is really important. But yeah, of course, it's like that's the problem with the video technologies is that they deteriorate. so much has been lost. So it's wonderful that you're digitizing some of this now. It's definitely a really important work.
Well, yeah, the digitizing process is the first part of making people let them, because we've had this stuff for a long time, but people don't know what we have. And actually, I said, in those few collections, In and Out and Lambda Digest, I don't know what we have, what's in those recordings. But yeah, the digitizing process is the first step in terms of getting a record of what we have. Then we can post it, and then people can do that research on it because they know what we have. That's unfortunate that, again, it's the same thing with a lot of archives, even with paper archives. Now, we have a lot of these collections that are given to us because we have so many, and because we don't have the resources and to be able to hire all these people and get all these people to process them, we're not really quite too sure what the extent of what we have. This is unfortunate, but we're trying to make headways on that in terms of being able to identify that stuff. So then people can go to a single database and type in, you know, ACT UP protest 1990, and then all these resources will pop up. We're not quite there yet. We're working towards that, but that is something that will make research much more easier in years to come.
Yeah, for me.
Well, you still have a few years to come.
Yeah.
Well, again, that's the thing that again, watching that recent 10% show that I posted with the daily interview type, the daily meeting, is that at the end they interviewed all these people that now these are, you know, when people do research, they want to, you know, hear stuff from Marie Kuda, from Rick Garcia, from Danny Sotomayor, from John Henry Damsky. I mean, those all four were there, and you can actually see their responses, which again, if it wasn't for the 10% show and other shows like that, you wouldn't have those snippets to record their actions.
Yeah, I think one thing I find fascinating about watching these shows is that there's such like a who's who in the LGBTQ community and in their moment. You see all these like all these people that you've read about, or maybe people that you've known or you've heard speak, or maybe they're your friends or whatever. You see them on TV, these leaders and artists and activists, it's wonderful to see sort of that preserved in that moment. I actually like created an Instagram account called Queers on Cable to sort of like document that part of my research for myself, and to show like who was on these shows and that they're really like a historically important for you know, the LGBTQ communities.
Yeah, because even with the 10% show, I mean, they, people would be visiting from out of town. So you have performers, artists from out of town, and also that again the segment we have from the Vampire Lesbians of Sodom, that Alexander Billings.
Yes, I just watched that earlier today, and I was like, oh my gosh, there's Alexander Billings.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that she got her start out in Chicago, actually at the Baton, is where she first started performing. But yeah, that was one of her first. I think it was one of her first acting gigs, was in the Vampire Lesbians of Sodom. So you get to see a young Alexandra Billings in that episode.
Everyone should watch that. It's really fun.
Yeah, again, that's one of those episodes that I wish I had more. We wish I had the raw footage of that to actually see that, to see the fullness of that show.
Totally. But yeah, it's really interesting how these like the film crews from the show, or the producers would go and film like queer theater, you know, it was like local queer theater that otherwise, you know, people would have gone to see it and then maybe and then would have sort of faded into the past, since, you know, theater is a live and ephemeral experience. But it's wonderful to see these sort of like underground queer productions, you know, however many decades later, especially to see actors who have become successful, and to see their start is really fun.
Well, that's the thing in terms of the diversity of the 10% show, is that it showed a lot from Mountain Moving Coffee House, which was a feminist separatist coffee house for a women's space, and they showed a lot of the productions that they had there. Again, capturing that aspect of history that we have lost. And the person that I thought that would respond to my wondering of who John Boswell, the book that John Boswell wrote, Paul, was able to present this of it's Christianity, social tolerance, and homosexuality.
Oh, great.
Was his important book back then. So thanks, Paul, for that. As I was saying that, I knew he would respond. We have two Pauls here, so that's one of the Pauls.
No, but yeah, I watched some of that footage from the Mountain Moving Coffee Shop, and it's interesting that there are these really sort of fascinating conversations about lesbian separatism, you know, like just people talking about their opinions, or interviewing Alex Dobkin about what she thought of it in the 90s. And then there was like the Miss Leather competition, and, you know, you like really almost never, you know, the leather community is historically underrepresented, and particularly women in leather. So to have these conversations, to be able to watch them, is really fascinating.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to ask him in a few weeks in terms of how they figured out, how did they get to all these places?
Yes, yeah.
It's almost like that they did sort of like a checkoff list of trying to get that. I don't know how intentional the diversity was, or if it just happened naturally, or, you know, just were they just that well connected with the community to be able to know that all this stuff was going on.
Right, yeah, let's remember to ask them.
Yeah. Well, I think it also sort of, you know, reminds us that Chicago was sort of like this, a lot of different conferences and stuff were happening in Chicago. So they had the ability to, because they did, you know, tap into the Girth and Mirth conference that was happening there. And they had a lesbian feminist conference that they also tapped into. So there's a lot of stuff that did come to Chicago that they were had that ability to tap into to have these various interviews at.
That's a good point. Yeah, they definitely took advantage going to all these different conferences. Even the PFLAG conversation was very moving to hear his parents talking about, you know, that transformative experience. And right, to be able to get folks to do that on camera is definitely it requires skill. So certainly a really, really wide variety of community represented on the show.
Okay, well, I think maybe let's see if anybody has any questions.
Yeah.
So again, if somebody wants to ask either Lauren or myself a question, if you just click on your little parts, we already have hands up. Okay, so I'll just first let Jen ask her question.
Hello. My question, as you were saying all of this, was that these shows where anyone could see them. So I'm wondering, was there any sort of conservative objection to these shows being on public access? Like, did people have negative reactions to these shows, and how did that get handled by the networks?
Yeah, sometimes yes. And we'll have to ask the 10% show folks in a few weeks of what happened in Chicago. I know that when Lou Maletta, who created the Gay and Cable Network, when one of his shows was basically a review of gay pornography, and which he could air on cable access because there were so few censorship laws for cable access. When he tried to air that in some cities around the country, particularly upstate New York, the local community got very upset, and they said that that there should be regulations, and that this sort of adult content was inappropriate. Which sort of this like homophobic reaction to watching, gay sex on screen when we know that heterosexual sex is on screen all the time. But oftentimes the cable access, gay cable access programmers would win because they were protected by these laws, that like free speech laws and regulations that said that there could not be the same sort of censorship on cable access. So Maletta won most of his cases. I mean, I think he eventually stopped putting his programming in that community because he knew it wasn't wanted there. But there was some pushback, yeah. I mean, and people would get letters, like I know Dyke TV got a lot of homophobic letters, and but they couldn't really get much pushback much legal pushback because they were protected by like free speech regulations.
But were there sort of guidelines or boundaries of what could be shown, what could not be shown? Or, I mean, could you have were you able to have like religious programming where you're trying to convert people? Or, I mean, were there certain boundaries of political advertising or whatever?
Yeah, there did end up being a lot of court cases about this because like the KKK tried to put programming on in like Kansas and a couple other different states, and then there were some obscenity regulations, and certainly televangelists were very present on cable access programming. There did end up being a lot of discussion and debate about sort of what actually were the regulations. And as time went on, it did get somewhat more limited.
Okay. I think I'll let's move to Rich. Rich has a question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, hi, Dad.
Okay. Hi. Well, I was going to say I'm actually Wil's father, and you should be able to see the family resemblance on top. So Jen, thanks. You kind of covered the first question I had, but I had two more. One is, so I remember cable television from the 70s, and most of it was very, very local. So I'm wondering if any programs like the 10% Show or others had a sophisticated or even elementary system of national distribution of sending out the tapes so that they would get broader airing. And then the second question is, Lauren, you mentioned that there were no Nielsen ratings of cable television shows. Are there other research tools today that enable you to analyze, the effect, the influence that these shows had on education about LGBTQ issues, both for the community, but also for broader audiences?
Yeah, those are two good questions. And let me just say, cable television is slightly different than cable access. Cable access is one part of cable television. So first, were there national distribution systems? Yes, that's what I was sort of briefly talking about this earlier. Lou Maletta with the Gay Cable Network was one of the first sort of pioneers of this, that he would send tapes of his shows to cities around the country, like Atlanta, to Cincinnati, to LA, to San Francisco, to Chicago, and also sort of recruited all these local producers in different cities to create their own programming. So the Gay Cable Network shows were distributed nationally, via the mail system. And then some other, Dyke TV did the same thing in the 90s. And your second question, how do I sort of measure the impact of these shows without Nielsen ratings? There's sort of a bunch of different measures. I mean, I look a lot at the gay press to see sort of like what reviews or what people were saying about these shows at the time, what they were writing about them, what they thought about them. I also have been interviewing a lot of the people who created the shows to sort of understand their own perspective on the impact and significance of these shows, to ask how their community responded. And I do archival research. So to see, you know, if people wrote in letters and if those letters were preserved, or if the shows won awards or that kind of thing. I mean, I also think one thing I think is important about these shows is actually they decenter the idea that a national audience makes a television show significant. Usually when television studies, and I think in popular understandings of television, we think about the shows with the widest audience having the most impact, right? Shows with millions or tens of millions of viewers are, you know, the most important to study because they're reaching the most people. And I think one thing that I've been finding is that that's not necessarily true. That had a very local niche audience, and make an argument that it was still significant in its community and in its moment.
Thanks.
Well, along that lines, it could be in terms of who was watching it. So basically, that if a few people watching it, then that inspired them to do something or to inspire in a certain way. So the impact would be much more exponential or processing as opposed to the actual people watching it. So
yeah, a lot of these shows inspired people to action, and I think that's important to consider for sure.
Or at least made them aware. Sort of like for me, I became aware of the various issues, the various concerns out there through watching this news magazine. Where just reading the gay to see the protests, you didn't actually get to see the conferences. You could read about them, but that's a very different thing than actually seeing it presented on video.
Thanks for saying that.
Any other thoughts or questions people might have on the concept of LGBTQ cable access shows? Okay. Well, I like this. I mean, although this is away from your topic, but there's also like a LGBTQ network for radio shows. I don't know if you're aware of this.
Vaguely.
Vaguely, okay. But yeah, but again, but it was sort of the same thing. And actually, one of the reasons that we have the recordings of the first March on Washington was recorded via one of these radio shows.
Oh, cool.
As well as the first rallies at the first gay pride marches in LA, Chicago, LA, and New York, since Chicago had the first one. Chicago, LA, New York. They recorded those, available on LP. So we actually have those recordings of those are actually very important historical moments because of this network existed. But yeah, there was sort of like a radio network too.
Yeah, no, that's so important. I didn't realize that the radio recordings of those shows existed. That's really interesting. But yeah, it's sort of a very similar idea that when you have marginalized folks get access to media technology, then they use it in order to educate their communities, to spread information, to think about and record histories of activism. So it's definitely in the same line as what I write about too.
Yeah. It probably was, again, comparing it to the feminist publication movement, it wasn't competitive, it was very collaborative between cities, between publications, and just sort of like my initial sense of both the radio and the video, the cable, was that it was much more collaborative, that they would help each other. Again, New York would send segments, shows in other cities would use segments from the New York show. I'm not quite sure if there was sort of a financial type relationship between that. But again, there was this collaborative nature of it, again, because it was more community-based, activist-based, getting the word out for one's community and wider community. There was this much more collaborative nature of spreading the word, getting stuff out, as opposed to competitive nature of, well, we have to produce a better show than they and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, no, I think that's for the most part true, especially around the activist issues. Like, and I know in the like in the mid to late 80s and early 90s, when you have like the rise of confrontational AIDS activism, that people would share footage with each other. You know, if one person is at the protest and someone else isn't, you know, they would like send it to the show. I mean, I know that there's some people like Lou Maletta, who I mentioned a couple times, he was maybe a little bit more competitive, like he wanted to have the best show. But so, you know, every once in a while a personality crops up, and it's fun to sort of hear a little bit about some rivalries or conflicts like that. But I think you're right, for the most part it was a very like collaborative nature, because it was sort of in the public service. Yeah.
I guess you probably could have I can't even say the word, rivalries, and wanting to have the best show, but it'd still be collaborative, that you want to have the best show, but you are willing to share what you do with other people, so they can also.
Right. Yes. Good point. Good point.
I want to thank Lauren for coming, sharing with us tonight, as well as other people that came to listen and participate. So with that, I'll sign off saying thank you all for attending. Bye.
Bye, everyone.